Well, as we mentioned at the beginning, this evening we're going to finish off our series in the book of Jonah by looking at what we know as chapter 4. Of course, we know that the original scrolls weren't divided up into chapters at all, but that's what we have. Imagine for a moment a screenwriter being asked to take the raw material, if we could perhaps have the next slide, being asked to take the raw material from the book of Jonah and use that to devise a script for a film or perhaps a TV series. I suspect that many a scriptwriter might be very tempted to finish that at the end of chapter 3. Why might that be? Well, although there are other ways in which we could look at the structure of Jonah, certainly by looking at the first 3 chapters, somebody would see a very recognizable narrative format. It begins, doesn't it, with a dilemma. At the beginning of chapter 1, we see this dilemma that Jonah has. Jonah is a prophet in Israel who has previously spoken only to the people of Israel. But suddenly he is confronted by God saying to him that he wants him to go to their great enemy, to the city of Nineveh, and to preach a word from God to them. So he has a dilemma, and therefore a choice has to be made. And long before the clash had to decide, shall I stay or shall I go, Jonah was faced with that same choice as well. And in fact, he decided to go, but not to Nineveh. As you know, he decided to go in the total opposite direction and head off towards Tarshish. And it was an absolutely disastrous choice that he made. And it led to a catastrophe. There he was on the boat, on the sea, and this tremendous storm comes, and Jonah himself recognizes that he is the problem, and the only way that these innocent sailors, or at least innocent of the reason for the storm, the only way in which they can be saved is by him being thrown overboard. So Jonah is thrown overboard, and obviously that leads to suffering. And although it was pointed out at the time that the great fish proved to be a physical salvation for Jonah, yet it must have been an extremely unpleasant experience, and he certainly suffered at sea and then in the belly of the great fish. But in the belly of that great fish, Jonah came to a self-revelation, to self-knowledge. He realizes how foolish he has been. He realizes that he should have obeyed God. He realized his disobedience had just led to disaster. So as I say, there is self-knowledge. Now, and self-revelation. Now, if there was going to be a tragedy for your film or your TV series, then what you would need now really would be for Jonah to die. That the self-revelation would come too late to really do him any good. So, a la King Lear or Othello, Jonah would have to die. But that's not what your raw material gives you, and you're quite pleased for that, because actually you'd rather have a feel-good film or TV series. And indeed, up to the end of chapter 3, that's exactly what you've got, isn't it? Because right at the end, you have resolution. Everything comes together. Everything is tied up neatly. Jonah is vomited up on the land. He obeys the command now to God to go to Nineveh. He goes, he preaches. The Ninevites are repentant. and God doesn't bring the calamity upon them. Everybody ends up happily ever after, or so it seems. The end, roll the credits. But that's not how your raw material ends. That's not how the book of Jonah ends, is it? Because the book of Jonah is not simply raw material for a film. It is a historical narrative that tells the truth about Jonah, and the truth is quite messy, as we shall see. I wonder if you notice when Brian read that passage, how often the word but came there. So what we have as chapter 4 provides an unusual end to an unusual book. It is an unusual book. It's usually counted as one of the 12 minor prophets, but I wonder if you've noticed how it differs from so many of the others. If you were to look at Habakkuk or Nahum or Haggai, you would see that the vast majority of those books is set out in verse, and it is set out showing the prophecies that they made. The majority of those books are made up of the words that the prophet said. But the book of Jonah is rather different. It's a prophetic book without much prophecy. In fact, it is limited to chapter 3 and verse 4, where Jonah says to the Ninevites, 40 more days and Nineveh will be overturned. That's it. That's the total sum of the fourth telling that Jonah gives to Nineveh. It's not very much in English. If you were to look at it in the Hebrew, I'm told that it consists of only 5 words. That's it. And you may notice with him, there is no pleading from Jonah. There is no heartfelt call from him asking the Ninevites to turn around. He simply says 40 days and the city will be destroyed. So this ending is strange and messy in many ways. If there had been ends coming together very, very neatly at the end of chapter 3, as we come into chapter 4, they are beginning to unravel. And they begin to unravel particularly when we look at Jonah himself. Because what we see is that Jonah hadn't really come to complete self-knowledge at all. His behavior had changed. He now obeyed God and went to Nineveh. He recognized that he couldn't carry on running away from God. But what we discover in chapter 4 is that his heart, certainly his heart towards the Ninevites, hasn't changed at all. And this 4th chapter can seem a bit of an anticlimax with its strange actualized parable of the short-lived plant. And there's no neat ending. In fact, there is very much an open ending to this book, where God asks a question of Jonah. He asks him whether he shouldn't have been concerned for these inhabitants of Nineveh and even for the cattle, the animals within Nineveh. But we don't know how Jonah responded. We're not given the answer to that. It's left hanging, the book, with this question. And I think that's because God wants us to consider that question ourselves as well. Well, let's look in a little bit more detail at this final chapter then. As I say, under my alliterative title of A Petulant Prophet and His Gracious God. So we first of all then see a petulant prophet, and his petulance is shown in unwarranted anger and almost risible self-pity. Whenever I read this chapter, I'm reminded of an incident a good number of years ago when we were babysitting for someone, and I can hastily let you know that it wasn't for any of you, so you don't need to feel too guilty about this one. But we were babysitting for a family, and one of the young children had misbehaved, and we had to tell them off, and they became very, very worked up about this. But were struggling in their early days to express themselves. But they said that they felt very, very sad and very, very angry. And there was a certain petulance there, which I must admit, it reminds me of Jonah in this last chapter. Jonah is angry. And first of all, above all, he is angry, as we see in verse 1 and 2, over the saving of Nineveh. Now we see the real reason why Jonah didn't go to Nineveh. We might have thought it was out of fear, because he was a single individual, and Nineveh was one of the most powerful cities of the time and the inveterate enemy of Israel. It would have been very understandable if Jonah had not wanted to go out of fear. And perhaps there was fear there. But there was a deeper reason, and it was simply this: he didn't want them to be saved from calamity. First and foremost, it wasn't a fear of the Ninevites, but a dislike of them. Interestingly, in the Abrahamic covenant, it was pointed out, wasn't it, that Israel was a very, very special nation to God, but through them being blessed, they would be a blessing to all of the other nations around about them. And yet that was very, very easily forgotten. And Jonah, like perhaps many of his compatriots, fell into a very narrow-minded patriotism, where it was Israel first and Israel almost only. It's perhaps understandable when we see how persecuted they were often by other nations. Understandable, but nevertheless we can't condone it. And they should have seen that that wasn't their purpose as God's light. I'm reminded again of the early church, and we know that people like Peter and Paul and the other apostles became convinced that God had drawn the Gentiles into the church as equal partners with their Jews. But throughout the period of Acts, we find that there were people who have no doubt were genuine Christians, genuine believers in Jerusalem, who really struggled to grasp hold of that. And perhaps some of them perhaps never really did come to terms with the fact that God was bringing Gentiles into the church on an equal basis as themselves. So Jonah was very angry that God should save them and save these Ninevites, and he makes that quite clear and he admits to it. But then a little later, we may find this even less understandable. He becomes very angry over the death or the withering of the plant. You see, Jonah is still hanging around, isn't he? He goes out to the east of the city and builds this shelter. Perhaps he is still hoping that God will relent of his relenting and that he will, in the end, destroy Nineveh. So he stays there watching to see what will happen. And God gives him this plant that grows up quickly and adds to the shade that his shelter had given him. And he's very pleased with that. But then God also sends a worm that destroys the plant the following morning. And Jonah becomes very, very angry about this. It's interesting, isn't it? When we have unwarranted anger, how often it falls into self-pity. And that's what we see, don't we, with Jonah, self-pity. A number of times he says that he wishes he was dead. It is better for me to die than to live, he says. I wish I were dead, he says. It's incredibly ungrateful. Think of what a contrast that is to chapter 2. Then in chapter 2, when he was in the belly of the fish, of the great fish, Jonah was praising God for having brought his life up from the pit. He was thanking God for saving him, thanking God for rescuing him and saving his life. But now, in his petulance, he wants God to take that away from him. So there we see Jonah, the petulant prophet, self-pitying and angry. How different is Jonah's God to the petulant prophet? He is full of grace. And that's shown in several ways in this chapter. First of all, his grace is recognized by Jonah himself. Jonah says, I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love. Here, Jonah quotes what had become almost a formulaic saying amongst the people of Israel. It was a way of describing God that God himself used of himself when he spoke to Moses. We find it in Exodus 34. And God here describes himself. And throughout the Old Testament, if you were to get a concordance, you would find several places where these words, or very similar words, are used by different ones of the prophets to describe God. Not one who is given to anger, not one who is given to swift and unthinking action, but one who is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love. So Jonah recognizes that about God. And surely if he recognizes that about God, he should have thought that he should be seeking to be like his God and not instead to be hard-hearted and with no compassion and quick to be angry. So his grace is recognized by Jonah, but his grace was also shown towards Jonah. And I can think of at least three ways in which his grace was shown towards Jonah. First of all, his grace was shown towards Jonah in that Jonah was born into the nation of the Israelites. And he knew, therefore, the law and the prophets himself, the sacrificial system, all of the ways in which someone could come close to God. And then he had been given the privilege of speaking for God, of being a prophet. And it certainly couldn't have been because of his excellent character that he was chosen. So that was one way in which God has shown grace towards Jonah. And then, of course, in the incidents we read about in this book, he was shown grace again by God in saving him from his disobedience. When he was cast into the sea, God could well have said, well, let's just leave him there to drown. I can always send somebody else. I'm not dependent on Jonah. Look at how disobedient he's been. He doesn't deserve this privilege. But God had graciously saved Jonah then and given him, if you like, a second chance, as he would do with Peter later. And as he does with you and me time and time again. But then his grace is also shown towards Jonah in how he deals with him now. How patient God is with him in explaining things to him and talking things through with Jonah. Again, instead of simply discarding him in dismay at Jonah's hard heart. So God's grace is recognized by Jonah. It is shown towards Jonah. And of course, thirdly, it is shown towards Nineveh. His grace shown towards Nineveh in his concern for this great city. What does God say about this great city? Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. Shall I not be concerned about that great city? So we see a picture here of that great city, and God's pity is drawn out by the moral bankruptcy and the spiritual blindness of the Ninevites. And you know, that made me think of another great city. When I looked up, I was a little bit surprised to find that York's population now is 210,000, because I'm sure I can remember when I was at school that I was told it was a city of around about 120,000, which perhaps just shows how old I am. But there we have York, another great city of more than 120,000, now more than 200,000. Now, of course, there are many, many differences between Nineveh and York. York doesn't have the power in our day that Nineveh had then. Yet, nevertheless, surely there is this similarity, that within York also, there are many, many people who cannot tell their right hand from their left in spiritual terms. God's word tells us that the inhabitants of York were born spiritually blind, bound, and spiritually dead, just as you and I were, whether we were born in York or somewhere else. And if God's grace has been shown to you, surely you should be longing that his grace and compassion should also be shown to many of the inhabitants of this city in which God has placed you and has placed me. But finally, let me just consider a purpose of the book of Jonah. I have just put it as a purpose rather than the purpose. I'm sure there are others as well. But I think a major purpose of this book for its readers throughout all generations is for us to confront our inner Jonah. What do I mean by that? man called Colin Smith, writing about this, said, some people teach us by their example. Jonah teaches us by his weakness. I wonder if we, like Jonah, secretly, we'd never admit to it. We'd never say this was our theology. But I wonder if in reality we secretly believe that we are more deserving of God's grace than some others. Jonah seemed to believe that he was more worthy of God's grace than were the Ninevites. You remember the parable of the unmerciful servant that Jesus told? You have this servant who was put into prison until he had paid his debt, and it was a huge debt, more than he could ever have paid. But the master had mercy on him. The king had mercy on him and let him go free. But then that unmerciful servant went out and found a servant of his who owed far less than he had, but showed no mercy or compassion to him at all. He hadn't learned from his forgiveness to forgive others. It seems that Jonah thought that perhaps he and his fellow Jews really didn't need to be forgiven all that much. Certainly not as much as those wretched Ninevites. There's a sense almost that he felt almost his forgiveness and grace shown was deserved. Well, may God help us to see ourselves rather as Paul saw himself, as the chief of sinners. And when Paul said that to Timothy, wrote that to Timothy, he said, in a way that absolutely thrills me, because if God should show mercy to me, the chief of sinners, then it means he can show mercy to anybody. And so there is real hope in my evangelism. So let's recognize the amazing grace that we have received from God. And may that as individuals and as a church help us to reach out in compassion and with hope towards other undeserving but desperately needy people. Well, let's close with our final hymn, which is a very fitting song to finish this book of Jonah. Salvation belongs to our God.